You already know how this one goes. A fanatic empire high on its own legend throws a punch at a country 10 times its size and gets flattened for it. Reckless, suicidal, idiotic, only that's not what happened. The men who drew up Pearl Harbor weren't idiots. They'd done the math. They knew almost to the ton how much bigger America was. They knew which way the odds fell, and they gave the order anyway. So forget, how could they be so stupid? That's the easy question, and it's the wrong one. The real one is quieter and a lot harder to sit with. What has to be true for smart, clear-headed men to start a war they've already proven on paper they can't win? Stay with me and you'll see it wasn't madness. What you may not be able to do is put a name to what it was instead. And if it's any consolation, neither can the historians who have spent their whole lives on it. To understand the gamble, you first have to understand the trap. Japan in 1941 was a great power built on a single fatal weakness. Its army was hardened by years of war. Its navy was among the finest in the world: modern carriers, superb pilots, the deadliest torpedoes of the age. Its industry had clawed its way into the modern era at a speed that had stunned the West. But the islands themselves were poor in almost everything a modern war machine needs to breathe. Little oil, little iron, limited rubber, limited tin, limited steel, limited supplies of nearly every raw material that turns ambition into ships and aircraft. For decades, Japan had solved this the way every industrial empire of the age solved it, by buying what it lacked from abroad, and increasingly by taking it. The most important of those imports, the one everything else depended on, was oil. Ships ran on it. Aircraft ran on it. The entire navy that made Japan a great power was, in the end, a machine for burning oil, and roughly 80% of it came from a single source: the United States of America. Japan pumped barely 7% of its own. Read that again slowly, because the entire tragedy is hidden inside it. The nation Japan was preparing to fight was the nation that fueled its fleet. Japan's war machine ran on the goodwill of the country it most feared. For a while, that contradiction could be managed, and then Japan made it impossible. In 1937, Japan plunged into all-out war in China. It was supposed to be quick. It was not. The Chinese would not surrender and would not be destroyed, and the war sprawled out across a continent, swallowing men, money, and materiel year after year with no victory in sight. The deeper it got, the more raw material Japan burned, and the more dependent it became on the very powers that disapproved of the war it was fighting. Washington watched, and Washington began to squeeze step by step in stages. It let an old trade treaty lapse. It restricted scrap metal and aviation fuel. Each turn of the screw carried the same message: get out of China. And each turn made Japanese leaders more certain that backing down now meant strategic suffocation, a great power reduced to begging for the resources to survive. Then, in the summer of 1941, Japan made the move that sprang the trap shut. In late July, Japanese forces moved into the southern half of French Indochina, a long stride toward the oil and rubber of Southeast Asia. To Washington, it looked like exactly what it was: preparation for further conquest. The response was immediate, and it was devastating. On July the 26th, the United States froze all Japanese assets. Britain and the Dutch followed, and by the first days of August, the flow of oil had been choked off almost completely. The clock started ticking that day. Japan had stockpiles, but stockpiles run dry. By the Navy's own estimate, its oil would last around 18 months of war. The Army's planners reckoned 12. After that, the most powerful navy in the Pacific would slowly grind to a halt. Battleships at anchor, carriers as scrap, an empire defeated without a single enemy shell ever landing on it. So this was the box, and these were the only two doors out of it. Behind the first, withdrawal, pull out of China. Abandon years of war, the conquests, the dead, the entire imperial project, and accept, in the eyes of Japan's leaders, a humiliation they believed would shatter the regime itself. Pull out of Indochina too, as Washington demanded, and Tokyo read that as renouncing its place as a great power altogether. Behind the second, seize by force the oil being denied them. Strike south, take the Dutch oil fields and the British rubber, break the embargo with conquest. But the road south ran straight through American power in the Pacific, and that meant war with the United States. Withdrawal felt like death. The Southern gamble felt like a chance. And to men who had built their nation's identity on the idea that Japan must never bow to the West, the first door was almost unthinkable. They would not take it, which left only the second, and the moment they turned toward it, they ran into the problem that haunts this entire story, the one their own greatest sailor had already named out loud. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto knew America. He had lived there, studied there, seen its factories with his own eyes. So when his government asked him what a war with the United States would actually look like, he did not flatter them. He could run wild, he said, for the first 6 months, maybe a year. After that, he had no confidence at all. None. The man who would go on to design the attack was, from the very beginning, telling his own leaders they could not win the war it would start. So how do you fight and somehow still win? Against an enemy that size, when even your own architect says the clock is against you? Here is the part the popular story always gets wrong. Japan's leaders did not look at America's size and somehow fail to see it. They saw it perfectly. They had run the numbers, and the numbers were terrifying. By almost every measure that decides a long war, the United States did not merely lead Japan, it towered over it. In steel, several times over. In oil, the lifeblood of the whole machine, many times over. By the broadest measure of raw war-making capacity, the American advantage ran to something like 7, even 10 to 1. A war of attrition, a long grinding contest of who can build more and replace losses faster, was not a war Japan could lose slowly. It was a war Japan could not win at all, and the planners knew it. So they did not plan a war of attrition. They planned the opposite, a war so short and so shaped that American industrial muscle would never get the chance to matter. The plan had 3 moving parts, and once you see them together, the logic clicks into place like a lock. Part 1, the prize. The real objective was never Hawaii. It was the oil and resources of the South, the Dutch East Indies, British Malaya, the Philippines, the Southern operation. Seize that wealth and Japan would no longer depend on American oil at all. The embargo broken not by negotiation but by conquest. Part 2, the wall. Once those riches were seized, Japan would fortify a vast defensive perimeter across the Pacific, a ring of island bases stretching thousands of miles. Any American counterattack would have to cross that ocean and break itself against that wall, island by bloody island. Part 3, and this is the heart of it, the bet. Japan could not destroy the United States, so it would not try. Instead, it would make the cost of victory unbearable, drag the war out, bleed American patience until a tired, distracted public also worried about Hitler across the Atlantic decided that recapturing some far-off Pacific island simply was not worth the price. And then Japan assumed America would do the sensible thing. It would negotiate. It would accept a settlement that left Japan its conquests. The whole strategy, then, was never about defeating America. It was about convincing America, winning the war not on the battlefield, but at the negotiating table, by making the battlefield too expensive to bear. And the men who designed this were not inventing it from nothing. They had done something like it before. In 1904, Japan had gone to war against the Russian Empire, another giant that on paper should have crushed it. And Japan had won. It opened that war, too, with a surprise attack on an enemy fleet at anchor at Port Arthur before any declaration. It won a string of victories, smashed a Russian fleet at Tsushima, and then, with both sides exhausted, a foreign power stepped in to mediate. Japan got a favorable peace. A smaller nation had taken on a colossus, struck first, hit hard, and forced the giant to deal. That war lived in the bones of Japanese strategy. To the planners of 1941, the parallel was obvious and it was reassuring. Port Arthur in 1904, Pearl Harbor in 1941. Strike the giant's fleet at anchor, win the opening, force the deal. It had worked against Russia. Why not against America? But notice the buried flaw in the template. The 1905 model had worked because Russia was an enemy that could be exhausted and willing to be talked into peace. The United States, it would turn out, was neither. And there is a deeper crack in this story, the one detail that should stop you cold. The Japanese Navy, the very service that would have to fight this war, did not, in private, believe it could win it. And it would not say so out loud. By the later testimony of Japan's own prime minister, the Navy's leaders doubted victory and wanted to avoid war. But they refused to declare themselves unready, because the Army would only stand down if the Navy admitted weakness first, and the Navy would not pay that price in prestige. The one institution best placed to stop the war chose silence instead. Even the attack itself cut against Japan's own cherished doctrine. That doctrine had dreamed of luring the American fleet across the Pacific, to be destroyed in one decisive battle in home waters. Yamamoto inverted it, carry the blow to the enemy first, at Pearl Harbor, and he forced the plan through over the resistance of his own naval staff, twice threatening to resign to get his way. The man who doubted the war most was also the man who gambled hardest to begin it. So the whole gamble came down to a single assumption: that America, hit hard enough and bled long enough, would rather cut a deal than fight to the end. This is where the road forks. Push the evidence one way and you get cornered men making the only sane bet they had left. Push that same evidence the other way and you get something closer to a daydream, a plan resting its entire weight on the one thing least likely to ever come true. Same documents, same dates, same men. Two completely different stories built out of them. Keep both open in your head because we're about to watch the bet get placed for real, and by the end, the call is yours. Even within Japan's own navy, the plan was considered dangerous to the point of madness. To pull it off, Yamamoto would send the heart of his fleet across thousands of miles of open, empty ocean. 6 aircraft carriers, the elite strike force known as the WWII. They would cross in total radio silence in winter, undetected, to a point a few hundred miles north of Hawaii. If the Americans spotted them on the way, the most powerful carrier force on Earth could be ambushed and destroyed in a single morning. He staked the future of the Japanese Navy on the bet that he could move it halfway across the Pacific without anyone noticing. And the astonishing thing is he did. The fleet crossed the northern Pacific in silence and arrived, undetected, in the dark hours before dawn on December the 7th, 1941. At dawn, the planes lifted off the decks and turned toward the island. 183 aircraft in the first wave, 171 more behind them in the second, 353 in all, crossing toward a sleeping island. On the island, it was a quiet Sunday morning. The fleet sat at anchor in neat, peaceful rows. Sailors slept or wrote letters home or stood in line for breakfast. And then just before 8 o'clock, a single stunned radio call went out across the harbor. Air raid Pearl Harbor. This is no drill. For roughly 90 minutes, the harbor was a killing ground. Bombs and torpedoes tore into the anchored ships. The battleship Arizona took a hit near its forward magazine and erupted, killing 1,177 men in an instant, nearly half of everyone who would die that day. The Oklahoma rolled over and capsized. One after another, the great ships of the Pacific Battle Line were hit, burning, settling into the mud. By the time the last Japanese plane turned for home, all 8 battleships in the harbor had been struck, 4 of them sunk. Around 2,400 Americans were dead. Tactically, it was a triumph. By the standards of the plan, it was almost flawless. In Tokyo, when the news came, there was euphoria. The Giant's fleet had been smashed at anchor, just as the Russians had been in 1904. And yet, hidden inside that triumph were the seeds of catastrophe. Here, the popular story and the careful history begin to part ways, and it is worth slowing down to see where. You will often hear that Japan made a second, fatal mistake that morning. It should have launched a third wave, the story goes, to destroy the fuel tanks, the dry docks, the repair yards, and by failing to, it left America the means to rebuild. It is a powerful story. It may also be largely a myth. Later scholarship argues the fuel tanks were hard to destroy from the air and easy to repair, the shipyard far too vast to cripple, the harbor channel impossible to block, and the famous shipboard argument over a third strike. In part, it was invented after the war by a single unreliable witness. So hold it lightly. Treat it as an open question, not a settled blunder. What is not in doubt is simpler. Admiral Nagumo, satisfied with what he had, turned his carriers around and sailed home. And then there are the carriers. The Pacific Fleet's carriers, the Enterprise, the Lexington, were out at sea that morning ferrying aircraft, and the attack missed them entirely. You will hear this called the Great Mistake, that the future of naval war floated untouched over the horizon. There is truth in it. Carriers, not battleships, would decide the Pacific, but it is easy to overstate. Battleships were the target any admiral of 1940 one would have chosen. Only 2 American carriers were even within reach, and sinking them would not have changed the one thing that mattered most: the bottomless industrial power waiting behind them. There was, however, one mistake that morning with no asterisk beside it, and it happened not over the harbor but in Washington. The plan had called for Japan to hand the American government a message breaking off negotiations just before the bombs fell, a thin legal warning. But decoding and typing delays at the Japanese embassy meant it was delivered more than an hour after the attack had already begun. And so the one thing Japan could not afford happened anyway. There was no warning. A strike meant to look like the legal opening of a war instead looked like exactly what Americans would call it for the next 4 years. A sneak attack, a stab in the back on a peaceful Sunday morning. In Tokyo, the crowds were celebrating. Yamamoto, by most accounts, was not. He understood what the cheering crowds did not. He had delivered the perfect tactical blow, and in doing so, he may have set in motion the precise catastrophe he had spent years warning his country to avoid. He had not started a short, sharp war that America would want to end. He had woken the giant and made it angry, and handed it a reason it would never forget. The Japanese plan, remember, balanced on one assumption: that a hard-hit, war-weary America would choose to negotiate rather than fight to the end. It was the one thing they got most completely wrong. Start with the psychology, because that is where the plan truly died. Before December the 7th, America was a deeply divided country. A powerful movement wanted nothing to do with another foreign war. The political will to launch a vast, bloody campaign across the Pacific simply was not there. Pearl Harbor created it overnight. When Roosevelt rose before Congress the next day, the whole meaning of the moment came down to a single word. His first typed draft had called December the 7th a date that would live in world history. He crossed those words out by hand and wrote instead, "Infamy," a date which will live in infamy. With one stroke of a pen, he reframed the attack not as an act of war, but as a betrayal. And a betrayal cannot be negotiated with. It can only be avenged. The sneak attack did not frighten America toward the negotiating table. It enraged America, and it united America in a single morning more completely than any politician ever could have. The divisions vanished. A country that had been arguing with itself the day before now wanted one thing with terrible unanimity: not a deal, not a favorable settlement, but total victory, unconditional surrender. The very framing of the attack made the compromise peace that Japan's entire strategy required politically impossible. There would be no deal. There was never going to be a deal again. The single assumption the whole gamble rested on was dead before lunch on the first day. Then there was the question of which navy Japan had actually destroyed. The battleships at Pearl Harbor were the pride of the fleet, and they were already the past. And here is the detail that turns the great victory into a tragedy of timing. Most of those sunken battleships were not gone forever. They sat in shallow harbor water. The United States raised them, repaired several in the very dry docks Nagumo had chosen not to destroy, and sent them back to war: the California, the West Virginia, the Nevada. The Oklahoma was raised but never fought again. Only the Arizona stayed where she fell. Japan had not sunk the Pacific Fleet. It had knocked it down for a few months and left it every tool it needed to get back up. And 6 months later, the bill came due. In June 1942, 6 months after Pearl Harbor, almost to the day, those same American carriers, the ones the attack had missed, met the Japanese striking force at Midway. In a single catastrophic afternoon, they destroyed 4 of its carriers: the Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, the Huryu. The Kaido Butai that had opened the war was gutted half a year after it began. Yamamoto's window, 6 months of running wild, had closed almost exactly on schedule. And on the other side of it was the long war Japan had already told itself it could not win. Which brings us to the last miscalculation, the one the planners had seen coming and gambled they could outrun: the industry. Once the war became the long war Japan had desperately tried to avoid, the outcome stopped being a question of strategy and became a question of arithmetic. Consider a single figure. In the year 1944 alone, the United States built more combat aircraft than Japan managed in the entire war. Across the whole conflict, the tally was almost beyond belief: 325,000 American combat aircraft against Japan's 76,000. Or take the ships that would come to decide the Pacific. In the 3 years after Midway, Japan built 6 aircraft carriers. The United States built 17. That was the gap the planners had feared. And once it was fully unleashed and fully enraged, it did not shrink. It widened into something Japan had no answer for at all. And here is the cruelest irony of all. Japan's plan worked. The opening went almost exactly as designed. In the months after Pearl Harbor, Japan ran wild, just as Yamamoto said it would. It took the Philippines, it took Malaya, it seized Singapore, it captured the oil of the Dutch East Indies. The prize was won. The wall was built. Every early move on the board went Japan's way. And none of it mattered, because the one thing the entire strategy needed, and America willing to make a deal, was the one thing that, after the morning of December the 7th, would never exist again. So cold calculation or fantasy. Here's the part that stays with you. The people who have spent 30, 40 years inside this question still can't agree. And that's not history failing to do its job. That is the job. We want it clean. We want them to be fools, or we want them to be monsters, because either version keeps us safe. Either version means it could never have been us. The truth won't let us off that easy. Pearl Harbor is what it looks like when intelligent, careful people run out of good options and talk themselves into a catastrophe, one reasonable-sounding step at a time. That's not a story about fanatics. It's a story about how the door to disaster almost always looks, from the inside, like the last door left open. Which is exactly why we still can't look away.